To go back to who's the paper for, is a possible audience funding agencies? Because a lot of the things we might well be recommending cost money.
Yeah.
I was going to say I'm not sure that is correct, but one audience I was having in mind is just educating people on this, because they've heard so much about modeling. So I agree with what Valerie was saying and what Dennis was saying. So we have to find a balance between these two. But I'm not sure funding agencies is a target.
Well, but no, I think I'd defend Nigel there, because one of the newest sources of funding is that Trinity College Cambridge has got together with a whole lot of people to put up some large amount of money for what they're calling the Trinity Challenge, which, as I understand it, is looking to fund research for preventing future pandemics, with an emphasis of a sort of data point of view. And I was thinking, how do we best engage with them? And I mean, they're set to be giving out large sums of money in 2021. I was thinking that one of the ways to engage with them would be if we could actually give them our future challenges draft. You know, we could say, here is a presentation of the kind of, which tries to put in perspective all the various different aspects that need work. So hopefully it would be an aid to funders, to sum that up.
Well, also would give weight to those who are trying to, to be in contact with funders, that this group has identified these sort of challenges. So it could be used as sort of evidence, maybe in an indirect way as well.
Okay, I'm convinced.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. That answers my question.
I think it might be worth, though, given all the ramblings we have had in recent conversations about the introduction, to get an overview of what modeling and epidemic modeling actually is, and write a book about it, or let Adam write a book about it. He's good at it, but.
I think it is actually a very good idea. I was thinking of doing that, and I sent a couple of emails to a couple of potential publishers actually already, so we can explore that.
Glenn, you were the mastermind of the current structure we have. Do you want to give an overview of where we think we've got to? I mean, in crude terms, we at least have some drafts of which have names beginning with 6.0, 6.1, etc. We have some drafts for up to section 3. So I think we haven't got 4 and 5 yet.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. I don't know, do the different groups want to say where they think they've got to with the... I think with 6.
4 and 5 haven't started yet.
Yeah.
Well, actually, we kind of had a brief chat, Glenn and I, and Lisa. We were going to draft something and send it over to you. I ran out of time.
Okay,
I don't know if Glenn also
ran
out of time.
I ran out of time as well. So.
And so I thanks for your email. I think we'll do that soon. But it's just.
So sorry, which one's that, Jasmina?
6.5.
0.5, right? Okay.
Has there been any discussion about 6.4? I forget who was.
Did Peter and Lisa? Have you spoken? So it was Peter, Lisa, and me as needed.
Yeah, not yet. Sorry, I had a busy week.
Yeah,
That's okay. So we'll maybe it's good to sort of leave those for next week. If we can nail down 3, up to 3, I mean, we'll be good.
So I think, yeah, with 6.2 and 3, I think we also had some discussion on the Slack channel about that some of this might be better in the estimation paper, and I think we were gonna.
And similarly, some of 6.4 may want to be in the interventions.
Yeah.
Possibly. So, but
I think when we were writing different parts in these point 2.3, I think we are putting in brackets link to somewhere.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
yeah, no, I think it's better to hang on to things here for the moment, if in doubt. But you know, make a note that there's a link.
Yes, I mean, certainly yesterday in the discussion with the estimation people, the same issues were coming up as to whether, you know, what things were models and what things were estimation. So I think there's a lot of potential overlaps between those two.
Do you think it makes sense if we maybe open the introduction and the colleagues who kind of led on that talk to us through it, we read it through and we see if is anything missing as it stands, and we go through this for the ones we have step by step.
Sounds good.
I'm sure there are, well, it's an outline, isn't it? I mean, Jampi and Peter wrote this, and I've tweaked it a tiny bit. But so Jampi and Peter might like to say something about it.
It's an old question. Yes, it's an old question whether you should write the introduction before or after having written the paper. And there's no definite rule. I mean, this introduction was written before writing the paper as such. So we don't really know if it really introduces what is going to come in the rest of the paper. It's a kind of general thing about some things you might classify models according to, but I'm not certain it's the right thing. I fear that it will have to kind of develop as the rest develops as well, and maybe changed in the end. It's not a bad piece of text right now, but it might not coincide with what comes up afterwards, especially the way we are going to write the paper, because one way would be to say there are certain kinds or ways of modeling that are not well covered today. We would like to see more results in this direction.
I think for the present going through of drafts, I would sort of vote for accepting the introduction as it is at the moment, because I think any changes should come when people who are writing other sections look back at the introduction and say, it would be nice if the introduction could say something about this, because you know, to link with our section, or alternatively, there's something in our section which really means something in the introduction is unnecessary. So I think the next stage should be for people in charge of the succeeding sections to look at that. Should be for them to look at the introduction and just see if it's relating satisfactorily to their section the way it's going. Mm-hmm. You know, you're right, Gianpaolo. It's an iterative procedure, isn't it?
Yes, I'm afraid it is. And we then have to formulate a stopping rule somewhere.
And I think, and similarly, we may or may not want to have an end section which we could call discussion. But I think it's too early to write that. We need to see what comes out in the other sections, and then just see if there's anything overarching or bringing things together that we would like to say at the end. Hmm. So I think we should move on to
try to write the other pieces. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the intention was to have a sort of scene setting, so that then the the subsequent sections could take off without having to have sort of background material, but whether one's picked the right things to put in the scene setting, you know, we have to wait and see, I guess.
No, my feeling is that one theme that maybe needs emphasizing these days is the difference between what we have called qualitative and quantitative modeling. And maybe also the purpose of modeling, whether it is prediction and what can be predicted and what can be reasonably predicted. I mean, prediction should be a way of saying, will it rain tomorrow or not, at least with some probability statement on the rain tomorrow, not things like it could rain tomorrow if it rains today and stuff like that, which is very much what models have been doing in prediction. If nobody does anything new, then this would happen. But that's not a real prediction. That's a kind of counterfactual, because we know that people are doing things today. And maybe sorting out these almost basic things about what modeling is and does and could do is a useful thing in a modeling paper. And then, of course, diversified into the various subsections of modeling could be about numbers of people get the disease, or modeling could be useful for intervention planning, or modeling could be useful for this and that. Already something as basic as modeling can be qualitative or quantitative in the way of understanding processes generally and trying to give numbers for what is going to happen. And how far can you reasonably give numbers which are not hypothetical, which are real predictions? What is a prediction? I mean, it's already an interesting question.
I mean, we do have a paragraph making a sort of qualitative, quantitative distinction, but perhaps that needs, well, I think all this needs to be amplified, but perhaps that's an important one, a particularly important one to say more about.
Well, yes, because nowadays I think most people outside our group here at the Institute think that models are something that really say how is the epidemic going.
Yeah.
And that's the least thing that models do, presumably, in some specific way.
Yeah.
But
I think
they can, subject to A, B, C, D, you know?
Yes.
But I think your comment before, Jem, Peter, about, you know, models being kind of tools for thinking about complex situations, you know, that's the key, isn't it? Because, you know, it's partly about prediction, but it's largely about thinking through various logical possibilities.
And then outside of that theory, you have to decide which one of these things I've taught is more or less applicable to reality. That's also an important step, but it's not really in the modeling, right? It's slightly outside to decide this thing. Maybe it's a question for statistics or whatever, but anyway, it's slightly outside of the modeling as such.
But I think we covered this in here. Maybe we need to expand it, but we have two paragraphs. One that talks about different interpretation of the model, the mechanistic, where you have curve fitting and the statistical component, and then we untangle qualitative versus quantitative. We can incompose these comments in those two paragraphs, I think.
Yeah.
Oh yes, no, but I think that in the general framework that you've written up, all this can have a place.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
But, I mean, I think what we have here is very good. I mean, I know it's very good, but it's just kind of, we can maybe leave it. I like the argument saying that as we are looking at 6.1, we come back to this and say, where is this put in? 6.2, where is that? 6.3, where is that? So maybe we should move on to 6.1 and just leave this as open on our laptop on the right-hand side or something, and just think where might arguments fit from as we are talking through those.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, no, but let's fill in the rest of the paper now.
Yeah.
And see what comes up or out or something like
Yeah.
that.
I mean, it's also what's said in the other papers as well. So I think it is. I think you're right. It's the thing that has to be finished last, anyway.
Can I fill this little gap and say that I'd like to kind of volunteer to help with some of these things? You probably don't know who I am, but I'm basically a sociologist and a computational modeler, so I've been intermittently involved in all of this. But unfortunately, I've got another meeting at past, so I'm going to have to leave you shortly, which is why I'm interrupting. But if you think that I could contribute anything, especially in terms of sort of behavioural or social issues,
Quite a lot, because I've been missing the part of predicting people's reactions to all the things that are happening, for instance, in the models.
I won't go into a long spiel about the impossibility of predicting human behaviour, but yes, something like that.
Nigel, would you like to be added to maybe a specific section as they stand right now, and then you can contribute when you have time, when you wish, and as needed?
That would be great, and I think I want to leave you to decide which section would be most appropriate.
Okay.
But the thing, Nigel, I don't think you should pass the buck like that, because we very nearly have drafts of all the sections. So I think you should look at those and decide where you'd like to be. One thing,
Okay, do that.
thinking of your sociology background, one thing you might like to look at, and whether it gets treated here or elsewhere, is with reference to interventions. There's a paper by a sort of a little informal paper by Hannah Clapham, which for some reason is actually under theme 10, the politics and policy,
Right.
which is really to do with how we model interventions properly, taking into account social and behavioral factors and the very different cultures in different countries. In other words, I think it's criticizing implicitly modelers who tend to think, oh, well, there's a certain kind of intervention, I don't know whether it's social distancing or whatever it is, and there's just one way of modeling that. And if I come out saying that people should all make sure they're between 3 and 4 meters away from other people, that's a well-defined intervention.
Yes.
And unaware that they're gradually, losing touch with reality as they develop their model. I think.
No, I'll take a look at that. That would be great.
But I think if you look more generally, I think if you look through the drafts, we're assembling the 6.x numbered things, and then. But I think we're having a very open collaboration, so that if someone who's down to be part of the team on 6.2 actually decides they want to comment on what's going on in 6.3, there's nothing to stop them doing that.
Yeah. Can I ask just a quick technical question? I have now access to the Dropbox, but if I edit those files in the Dropbox, is that the way to do it?
If you edit, if you think you've made enough changes that you would like to save the copy for other people to look at, then the convention is to put your initials, so NG,
right.
and then the date. So NG, if it was today, what would it be? It would be 20 Nov.
Yes. Okay, I'll do that. Yeah. Super. Sorry to leave you.
Thanks for joining us, Nigel.
See you soon again.
See you again.
Yeah. Bye.
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 That's very
Were we on
good.
6.1?
6.1. So who's going to tell us all about it?
Well, I don't think there's very much to tell on 6.1. 6.1 is basically what came from Glenn's draft. It's that section has been moved into a separate document. We've moved around a few things and added the bits that on my screen are in red. to what was already there. But obviously, as you can see, it hasn't gone very far beyond that.
It's a bit stream of consciousness, really.
Well, it's I think in Glenn's original draft, there were 2 sets of 5 bullet points. And what we've really got, I think we've still got, well, 2 things have lost their bullet points and gone up to the top, but otherwise there are basically the 10 bullet points are still there. So very little has actually changed, I'm afraid, since last week on this.
Yes. Although I tend to interpret the title as, in some sense, in defense of the qualitative modeling.
Yeah. I think what did come out of our discussions, we did start to discuss this, and what came out of this was an extra paragraph in the introduction in 6.0. So I suppose that was about these things. So that was a start, that we felt that some of this is actually more in this sort of general introduction than in, you know, in new challenges.
Yes, but once we have said that there is something to say positive about qualitative modeling, just for understanding generally what kind of things can happen if you assume certain things, etc. Then, of course, here we could have, as is more or less the text now, kinds of problems that we feel are not very much discussed in this qualitative way, right?
Yeah.
We already have various points here. Develop theoretical underpinning for novel structures. We could try, for instance, contact tracing. There are not so many. I mean, you could ask for ways of looking at the effect of going forward, backward, combining the 2 things in an abstract way in a graph or whatever. And not all of that has been done. And there are several other things, as for instance, now that Nigel is with us, it's something that I miss very much, some kind of trying to model population behavior in response to the spontaneous response to diseases, to spread, to fear, to interventions. And not just saying if 70% will stay at home and the others 30 won't, but how could we find some good data on this or some model for this? So, for instance, incorporating sociological things in disease spread models wouldn't be bad. At least try, or conclude, as Nigel seemed to say, it cannot be done, which then we leave modeling some other way. So find some themes that we feel are underrepresented and maybe explain why they're underrepresented, how they could be developed. That also opens the way. If somebody who has a lot of money reads this and gets impressed by it, then we already have teams for which one could ask for money. Then say, I will develop models which contain sociological, etc. So try to find some themes that we feel are underrepresented in this qualitative understanding of things. Of course, this is very much interacting with what data could then be got about these things to make them practical, etc. But notwithstanding, we already have a lot of quantities in our models that do not exist, in the sense that we have parameters like infectivity profiles and susceptibility profiles that cannot really be measured by anything physical. We just have correlated quantities maybe to these parameters that we investigate in our qualitative understanding. So one could go on like that. Okay, then that was it.
I think that in this respect, something to keep in mind, which I have been thinking a bit about, I don't know whether it should be written down, but is that when for example, contact tracing, I think, is a very good example, is that it's, you have the people who do individual-based modeling, I would say. Yes, probabilists often, if you do the mathematical modeling, with quite a strong mathematical conscience. And contact tracing creates all kind of dependencies, which makes the modeling very hard. On the other hand, if you are from a more population-based configuration or compartment model perspective, contact tracing doesn't really make sense, because you want to know who contacted whom, and you have to go to the individual level. So it's kind of the in-between where people should leave their mathematical conscience and perhaps just ignore dependencies while and not be or actually accept to be mathematically wrong and admit that, obviously. And I think there is a challenge there because it is really in between. You need to have stochastic models for contact tracing. Deterministic models won't do the job, but you know, on the other hand, you cannot. You have to ignore dependencies to say something meaningful, or you have to be very clever.
I agree, Peter, and I think this is an important point why contact tracing, and I mentioned this at previous meetings, why contact tracing hadn't been modeled within compartmental models before. And I mentioned this again, at my group, we focused at the very beginning, we were not doing predictive modeling, we were developing a contact tracing network on probabilistic theory based on the idea that if you have a large population compartmental model and you stratify down, converging towards an individual level, you can make assumptions along the way, but you can get to the agent-based probabilistic modeling of contact tracing. And I think this is an important thing to put there, how you kind of do it. So the only two papers that have, in my opinion, done this, there is an old paper by Fraser and Ferguson, which ignores asymptomatic testing and tracing, and then we kind of extended it to include that. So that's one point. The second point I wanted to make, I agree with Jumpy that it's really important to include the behavioral content in the developing and understanding of these models, and how much that bias is, you know, your predictions. But I'm not sure that that part sits here, or whether that sits more in the introduction.
No, but we will have to rewrite the introduction.
And then the concept, and then maybe, because I'm reading through this 6.1, and the first key challenge around understanding impact of different modeling structures and formulation of behavior within models, I think these two paragraphs we just talked about in the introduction, maybe they fit better here, and then an overarching incorporation of logistic, behavioral, social science component within models goes in the introduction. What do you think? I mean, I have both documents open on mine, so it's easy for me to see which one I mean, but if it's not clear which one I mean, tell me.
Yes, but it depends a little bit on the final format of the paper. I mean, if we really think that the paper will have exactly these section headings, or if this is just for our developing pieces, and then maybe the paper will have different section headings. So I don't know. It's a topic that should be mentioned somewhere in the paper, maybe.
I mean,
But
my
let's first develop the topic, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
we can place that paragraph somewhere.
I-
Because I'm quite sure that we will change the introduction at the end when we have seen the various paragraphs that have emerged about different kinds of wishes for new models, a critique of old models, comparisons, whatever that has to do with this modeling.
because the title "Developing Understanding and Perspective" to me says learn from what we know about modeling and apply that to make a prediction, i.e. learn towards a perspective. But I'm just saying it's because what you have here is wonderful. Just wonder whether we move those two paragraphs here. But I'm happy to leave it for now and think later if you think that's appropriate.
Can I ask one thing that I didn't see on the 6.1 list, and maybe it's somewhere else, or maybe it doesn't fit at all with this, is it came up yesterday briefly at the estimation, the idea whether the exponential waiting times is the right sort of model to be using. So that idea that, you know, we all use a Gillespie algorithm, is that what we should be doing? What happens if we use something else? Just as another challenge.
That's an excellent research point. I mean, exponential waiting times are nice, and in Q, in theory, what comes out of them, the general formula, usually hold because of ergodic properties. But in nonlinear systems, nobody is sure if the distributions would go through with the means wherever. So effectively, the effect of replacing exponential holding times with general distributions need to be investigated theoretically in various ways and combinations. And not all of them have been investigated. Some of them have. I mean, if your infectious period has another distribution, then R0 looks the same if you just have the mean of the infectious period around. So that we know. But other combinations we might not know. I mean, changing distributions.
Certainly, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I mean, I brought this point up yesterday in estimation, and I'm sure I've written it down somewhere in one of the.
I was going to say the same thing. It's in the UQ thing somewhere to talk about, you know, in terms of model choice, the effect of non-exponential intervals. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't appear also here from the more sort of theoretical perspective of what can be said.
Yeah, I mean, it's implicitly in that statement about how model misspecification impacts fitted models. But yeah, I think on a better theoretical tools for handling them was also.
I just put in the chat, maybe that fits better in the prediction or the data part.
I also had a slightly more general point, just which I think relates to kind of all of them, and I guess you will develop as it goes forward, but many of them are still quite sort of general challenge points, and I feel like they're ones I've heard come up time and time again. And so I guess the real challenge is, why haven't they been done before? Because it's hard, and I guess why is it hard? There's probably some mathematical reason sort of underlining that, you know, like the complexity of when you've got trying to combine a within host model with a between host model, and you end up with huge numbers of parameters, and how do you sort of what did that even mean when you're doing something from individual based to population based? So I guess it's maybe just a reminder, which I'm sure you guys will do, but just to not forget to drill down to sort of what the actual mathematical challenges are. I guess just coming back to the idea that this is from a Newton Institute perspective. So just something to bear in mind. Why haven't people done this before? And I guess sometimes some of those may even be challenges, like with the UQ, maybe it's a challenge of trying to bridge across different communities. It's not that people don't know how to do this. It's maybe that the two communities haven't interacted.
Well, I guess there they would be looking at it in the context more of specific models and the effect of changing that structure in, you know, to non-Markov in that way. Whereas here we might hope to be able to say something, you know, about the change or the differences sort of more generically. But
I think as well, so in the sort of overall draft, I had put this table at the bottom, and my idea for the table was to mention the kind of mathematical techniques which are relevant to the different topics, which I think goes some way towards what you're saying, Kira. So, you know, how are we going to tackle these things? You know, are they impossible? Yeah, like you said, are they impossible, or are they sort of near, you know, relatively doable, but just haven't been done?
Depending on how we see, I was just thinking, well, I was thinking several things there. One was that, of course, if by extracting out different sections of Glenn's document, we might between us manage to lose the table. So we mustn't forget that things like that are there. But the other thing was that presumably we would have some sort of discussion at the end of this paper, and that maybe if there's no better place, points like that could be addressed a bit there.
I fully agree with that, Valerie, and I think that's when we bring it together about exactly why these things haven't been done, and is it often, I think it is because we hadn't thought about it, and we'd never thought there'll be another pandemic where contact tracing will be the major thing to look in an SAR model, and I think that's important. Sorry, I interrupted somebody when I spoke.
Yeah, I think, coming back to what Kara said, if we come back to the mathematics, we also have to think of different things mathematically. And I think we are not interested in the mathematical challenges where we want to solve the things that every physicist knows and every mathematician believes. Like
okay.
You know, there are many of those problems which are very hard to prove, but we cannot, while physicists freely use them, and biologists and modelers, I think. That is not a thing. Well, I am interested in those things, but I don't think that's the focus of this paper, right? And then there are the things which are also for the physicist hard to grasp if they want to do a bit more than simulation.
No, I guess that in modeling we are quite happy with some kind of reasonable heuristic result that is not contradicted by simulations. We are ready to accept it as probably true, that something like that. In that sense, it's more close to physics than pure mathematics, right? No, the thing is, if we speak about contact tracing, in what kind of model can we get some feeling for what is going to happen that is useful also in some kind of practice? How do we have to formulate a model as such is a problem. Should it be that I look on a fixed graph and then I start counting how large is the connected component until I reach people I cannot find or whatever? Or should I look at it in some other way in order to get something out of it that represents the effect of contact tracing? I mean, of course you can represent contact tracing in a compartmental model. You just have to split infectives into those that were traced and those that were not, and they have different lengths of infectious period or something. And then you say, this represents the effect of contact tracing, with some probability that an infected will be traced before his natural end as an infective. But is that sufficient to have this split of infected in two classes? Does it represent all forms of contact tracing? I mean, those are questions which are interesting to develop, right? Because it is a representation of the effects. I mean, some people will be traced, others will not be traced. And what does that matter? Okay.
But you throw away a lot of dependencies, which are quite essential.
Yes.
I was just about to say that, yeah.
Yes, of course I do. But that's one approach. And then somebody says, no, that was wrong because the dependencies are important. So show that. One could show it by comparing it with an individual-based model and say the predictions are different. How comes? But that already is a paper if you compare a compartmental model with an IBM, which in some sense should be comparable, and you see that the consequences are different. That would be a new paper, I guess.
So John P., we did that in our paper. I'm going to put the link here now, because we did exactly that. We developed the SCI and compare it with two, a simpler and a more complicated mechanistic ABM.
But I'm a specialist in discovering things that have already been done.
Sorry.
I know that.
Can I ask about what I just thought is vaccination? So developing these models will have a really important concept towards, as we're looking towards vaccination, and depending when this paper will come out, we do need to discuss about modeling of vaccination. Just saying that we should have that somewhere, and the challenges around that, and linking it to sort of who do you vaccinate? Does the infectivity and susceptibility profiles that we learn from data affect the decision and things like that? We don't need to decide where, but we should have it at the back of our head that we should have that somewhere.
You mean in addition to the intervention section, sort of have a kind of, more kind of theoretical kind of questions about vaccination?
I think it's important to address it. Depends when this paper will come out. If we have a vaccine and this is all kind of irrelevant, then or not. I doubt that it won't. It will be.
But like so in my mind at least, the intervention 6.4 vaccinations is one of the interventions that we would discuss.
But I wonder whether we put that the use of modeling that has been used previously. So for example, for seasonal influenza, there was a model that was developed, and in the pilot season, it was used to assess what would happen if you vaccinate over 65 and gradually pediatric groups. And then to lead the decision making of what would happen in 2015, 2016, it was run in 2013, 2014 season. It might be diverging from the topic, but just pointing out that in the introduction, there is a use for putting decision when we talk about the use of predictive modeling. It's also vaccination should be mentioned and then linked, as Glenn said, to interventions.
But Jasmina, do you see real challenges in this, or do you see it as a problem where you in principle know how to deal with it, but it's just not done yet?
I think a little bit of both. I see a challenge that we'll just vaccinate people, the immunity will wane, and then we'll have to do it again, and you'll just have to reinvent the wheel. And then do you just give another dose of the same? I think one question that people aren't posing around vaccination is, should we be potentially giving one type of vaccine to start with and then start a different type of vaccine as a second dose, rather than having the same? So one that, for example, controls severity and one that controls transmission. Those are the potential candidates, right? That's what I see as a challenge, decision around that, where modeling can help.
Also, I mean, there are also challenges in terms of making sure you get the right people vaccinated, and if you're not doing sort of kind of uniform vaccination, you're targeting particular groups, then you might have different uptakes in those groups. That's I don't know whether this is just a sort of like accounting problem or a theoretical problem. I'm not particularly clear about what the theory says about this. So like, you know, the standard kind of herd immunity equation for vaccination, does that hold in all circumstances? I mean, the literature seems to, my reading of the literature is that that's what people assume, but I'm not 100% convinced by that.
No, you have the paper where Peter is co-responsible with Tom Britton and others, that if you can the disease vaccinates more efficiently than a normal vaccination campaign if there is a difference in susceptibility.
Yeah.
Most susceptibles first. And so if we could find the same strategy, we could of course optimize vaccination by doing as the disease would have done and stuff like that. No, so the usual herd immunity equation is unnecessarily homogeneous. And
yeah, and I remember when we were doing group modeling, a long time ago, Gianpaolo, you talked of the equalization strategy.
Yes.
You want to hit the people who have most contacts preferentially, so you're trying to make the number of contacts that the most efficient. The conjecture is that the most efficient vaccination strategy is one which leaves everyone with an equal number of contacts. If you leave heterogeneity, you're making things worse.
But there was no differential effect in terms of age structure there, was there? So that would make quite a difference, presumably.
Yes, it was on household size. It was on household size that made this.
No, I mean that was a simple result, Barry, and I'm sure for the present context there would be more, more sophisticated.
But maybe that's the challenge, is to find out.
But the basic idea is that I suppose that the sort of classical result is a useful back of envelope sort of indicator of where you start from, but that you really need to look at the pattern of contacts, and particularly heterogeneity in contacts, much more closely to work out the best vaccination strategy.
But it must depend on what you decide what characteristic it is that you're trying to optimize over. In that case, presumably it was number of cases, final size of the outbreak probably, or something like that. Whereas here we might want, in something like this, they might want deaths or, serious hospitalizations or something. Yeah. Something where you would need that age structure to go in and to think about what the variables of interest really are.
Sure.
Which is going to make it. I think with a lot of what we're doing, there are big optimization challenges really in trying to see how to.
But I see as a challenge, or I don't know, I think that is a challenge regarding vaccination, is that most models we study are about vaccination ahead of an epidemic. So you do it before the epidemic starts. And do you want to do a model vaccination in an ongoing epidemic or pandemic? It's a different story. Then you got to those things as which is effectively the same as a vaccination with a perfect vaccine, but probably we shouldn't sell it like that. What you had with the avian influenza, the culling of birds. If you find an infected farm, do you cull from the outside in or from the inside out? Those are questions which are, where modeling is important, how to get a good model. But many of the things which are said here, like, okay, we have a multi-type model. If we vaccinate in advance, then we kind of optimize over a parameter set if we know what the vaccination would do. But mathematically, there is not a real challenge there. It's just using Well, I'm always optimistic about this, but so I might be completely wrong. But
What-
I think don't see the mathematical challenge in just putting in the right parameters in our multi-type model.
I think what I see as a added challenge, if you don't see that as a challenge, Peter, is linking within host and between host modeling, where you vaccinate people with different virulence or that influences infectivity profile. So if their viral load is of certain size and you vaccinate them, does that make them less or more transmissible or less or more susceptible? Depending what the vaccine does, or does it just reduce their severity, brings the viral load down? And I mean, we don't, or maybe I don't know enough about the within host characteristics of each of these vaccines to link them to how that will translate to not just one parameter, but to a distribution or a profile of parameters that we then optimize in a between host modeling. Does that make sense?
Yes, but many of these questions have been examined by, say, Halloran or other people who have done all this classification into the various ways a vaccine might work and different R values that then result from vaccination with these different effects and whatever. One of the problems is to understand what these parameters really are in a population. And to formulate a practical question about vaccines is that we are going to vaccinate with vaccines whose duration we know nothing about, or just we know by analogy with similar things. How are we going to monitor the duration of the protection in the population, for instance, if the disease is not completely eradicated all over the world? That is also a problem in our situation now, because we don't have experience with these new vaccines. The only promise is that they will probably work in the short range of time, but for how long, we don't know. So how are we going to monitor that and start planning for revaccination or whatever? And there are plenty of specific problems. And in this case, the duration will be a problem, right? And it will also be a problem for evaluating natural duration, because while we start vaccinating, the infectious pressure on people will change, and then to evaluate how long the natural protection was will be difficult because there's not enough infection pressure. And okay.
Maybe we just need to put some words on paper in different parts on this, and then let other people write them in red or in green, depends what you mark with. And then we kind of see where we are next week.
Yes, but the question is, I mean, once again, the level of the paper, is it useful to try to formulate a specific problem that I then see right now? So this duration thing and evaluating in the future, whatever, I could try to write it down, but of course, it might be that somebody else has already thought about that or written about that in some similar context. I don't know. But it's a kind of specific challenge, right? How do we evaluate the duration in ongoing vaccination, in a sense? Or should we keep the paper at a more general level, that there is a need for better understanding of optimal vaccination policies and surveillance of protection in the population?
No, I think that specific example, so that would fit under 6.3, I think, in terms of, how do you use models to inform your data collection? Because that, that is going to be a generic issue in future pandemics as well, isn't it? That you might have to develop a vaccine, in real time.
While the disease is there and etc. Yes.
But you won't know how it's going to respond in that particular pathogen. So I think that's a generic question, and so maybe what you said would fall under that in terms of.
No, I guess that some specific examples at least might be interesting to, if we think they are sufficiently new in the sense that they have not already been answered by something.
Yeah.
because it makes reading also more specific than just saying we need new knowledge about diseases, which is true, but it's not very
Yeah.
enthusing. Okay. So shall we get down to try to write down some individual ideas on what needs to be developed?
I'm sure we should. We haven't looked at the sort of updates to 6.2 and 6.3. So should we talk about those briefly? I mean, I know some of what we've said has already affected those, but would it be worth just having a quick look? I know Dennis and I are both involved in another meeting and would quite like to stop fairly promptly on this, I think. I don't know about others too. But maybe we should look at those too.
I think for me, I put together 6.3. There was a lot of overlap with estimation yesterday, and it sort of preempted a lot of the discussion that was had. So at least from a very basic level, it would be useful to have some feedback on how much of this we think is relevant to the modelling paper and how much could be passed over to the estimation, if anyone has any comments on that. So all the stuff about observation models and data validation and evaluation are all kind of covered here, which is what we were talking about yesterday in the estimation.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, so if we jump into 6.3, I mean, I inserted a paragraph at the top, which I think is, so I think a lot of what you said there, Ben, is really, would really be better in the estimation. You know, it's kind of, whereas I sort of inserted a paragraph at the top, which is what I kind of think in this chapter, we kind of, the sort of things we need to be saying. And actually what JMP just said there about, you know, trying to sort of understand in real time, understand what the vaccination is, how the vaccination is performing, could also be an example of this. But
yeah,
the problem is that almost all the things we do have this feedback property. That I do a model and then I say theoretically understanding the duration of vaccines is very important. Then somebody says, okay, how can we get data of that? And then once we have data, how can we then estimate a parameter in the model that says what the effect is? And then etc. So many of these things are feedbacks. I mean, you have this model and then maybe somebody gets data on things that are in the model and then somebody says, how can we estimate better? And then we change the model because then we say there's more details to this and that.
But I think, you know, as a challenge, you know, understanding how when you create a model with certain processes in it, how when you fit that to data that performs. I think that's the sort of general kind of modeling challenge, which probably isn't going to be covered in the estimation paper.
No.
Maybe.
So in essence, whether you build a model with the data available or whether you use the data to and the model to sort of build it, is the feedback always both ways, and does it change as we move through the epidemic?
Yeah, and also if your model structure ignores certain things, you know,
Yeah.
how is that going to be impact? You know, how does that impact your use of the model? I guess.
Because the whole point is that the models, I think the key thing here is that the models are very data reliant, and we said somewhere that the models are as good as the data they have, and I think that point is clear here. So we either ignore structural changes within the model because the data we have is scarce and we can only use that, or we develop everything and we make assumptions, again, because the data is scarce, or we have every possible data, or we need to collect every possible data. And then what's the point of the model? We have to discuss. Do we want anything else? I mean, so does that mean that 6.3 will stay like this for now, but potentially parts will go in the estimation paper, and then this will kind of be tailored at the time?
Yeah, I think
yes, but I think that one thing that should be mentioned is that models inspire data needs, and data collection inspires modeling. And
I agree. Yeah,
we
that's
must-
why I wanted to put that in this section, although I kind of went off into kind of areas of estimation. I think there is definitely a relevance to building models with data in mind, or at least building models and then doing some degree of analysis on those models to make sure that we're doing
And the advantage of the model is that the modeler can imagine data that are not available.
exactly. Yeah.
And then see what would happen if we had this and that is produced of this quantity.
And in data sparse times, particularly at the start of the epidemic or pandemic, that's going to be one of the few things you can actually do is work out what data you would want before it starts to come in.
Yeah. And also, you know, you can do I think you can do quite a lot in terms of, you know, simulating what might happen in an outbreak. And if you collected this sort of data and not this sort of data, what kind of position would you be in? I think that's, I mean, it's not maybe theoretically challenging, although I think there will be issues in terms of just how you do the inference. But I think it's a kind of important thing that we should be saying needs to be done, because, you know, we'd in an ideal world, we want to have, you know, or governments to have a very clear idea of the sort of data they should be collecting, you know, at different stages in an outbreak. So, you know, what kind of surveillance should they be doing regularly, routinely, to make sure that we don't get caught out next time.
Seems like a natural extension to the kind of probabilistic forecasting that is generally done, and then feeding that back into, well, this is what we currently know, what do we need to know next?
And links really well to the estimation where you know, Dennis put it very nicely yesterday, where we had to look at the estimation at different stages of the epidemic. That's what we're doing in the paper, looks like. So this will link naturally to what happens with the data there.
And then there is a chapter of, I admit that it is self-serving, because I've tried to write things about the distortions of data when you collect them in certain situations, like say during exponential growth and things like that. That you get estimates that are not really what you think they are if you're not careful. But that also has to do with what are the real what we call sampling situations for data, and which ones are distorting in some sense the meaning that people generally give to the parameters, which ones do not distort. I mean, looking at the infectivity of a disease within families, how distorted is that of the general infectivity of a disease? We don't really know things like that, and there are many things like that that can be discussed.
Yeah. And also suggestions potentially.
I think it was said yesterday. Yes, it was said yesterday in the estimation section that one should have observation models apart from other models, that model the observation scheme, the sampling scheme, as the physician would call it, I guess.
But also you could, I think what I had in mind here was that you would go to the next stage and say, given so you would try and learn a lot about the sorts of issues that would come up and how you might deal with them. But also you could then say, actually, one of the ways to deal with them is to collect the data in a slightly different way, which maybe mitigates some of those biases.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's what we're saying to the government, that, you know, actually that's what you should be doing, or you should be preparing to do this.
But it's also a question of, let's say, economical efficiency, that either you model the biases in cheap data, or you plan for an expensive, good data collection system that doesn't need bias correction.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to know what those biases are. So if you go down the cheap approach, then at least if we have them, so again, I mentioned this in the document, that if we have the metadata available, that we know exactly how that data was collected, we at least have a chance of knowing what the potential biases are, and we can statistically try and correct for those. Whereas if we just have cheap data we have no information on how it was collected, what the biases are, then that's the kind of worst case scenario, that we know there'll be biases there, but we don't know what the biases are.
But also, I think there's a reevaluation of what cheap means, given how expensive this pandemic has been. And also there's
Yes.
issues to do with, if the whole world is going to do this thing, then you would get economies of scale in terms of collecting certain sorts of data.
But it's not only cost, for instance. If you speak with medical people in this situation, we could get much more data if each doctor for each patient filled in a long form with a lot of questions about what he asked the patient, but he doesn't have time.
Yeah.
So of course, you could say that that's a cost problem. We would have to hire special interviewers that are beside the doctor then to do the interview and whatever. That would be an extra cost. But there are various kinds of costs in getting information.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah.
Because I've heard that very often when speaking with the medical people about contact tracing, that the answer is, I don't have time to sit there 2 hours to try to find out exactly who met whom and in what way, etc. I must go on to the next patient.
But then there are things that could be done in terms of linking medical records and having that
Yes.
more available. So, you would know the sort of
Yes.
comorbidities of a given case, if you're following individuals. So.
Mm-hmm. No, that's perfectly true, and that is already in some countries quite well organized. In other countries, difficult because they have regionally different systems or whatever.
Yeah,
many things like that.
Yeah, and no doubt a lot of these kind of issues will touch on kind of personal and kind of national approaches to sort of privacy and being told what to do, or so you might want to test X number of people, but you might not be able to do that very easily because they refuse, or
or you cannot link one testing time with another testing time because you don't have the identity, for instance. But is this not something there's not a data paper somewhere? There was a data paper among the papers, right?
There is supposed to be a data paper. I don't think it's got very far. So maybe
we
that
might either absorb it or.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a moot point where this goes, but I think models actually are very useful in terms of thinking through these different scenarios and trying to understand what.
And that is not generally acknowledged in statistics, that you should simulate data collection systems just to see what would happen if people didn't respond, special people didn't respond, this and that happened. It could be quite useful as a method, but it's not generally taught as a statistical method.
Yeah.
Simulate what could go wrong with your collection of data, because everybody says, let's have a random sample, which is never true, I guess, in practice. Okay.
So Jasmine, do we want to go through 6.2 as well?
Yeah. So maybe do you want to go through it, Glenn? So yeah, Glenn, Ben, and I worked on this after we talked about it. Do you want to do it, Glenn?
I'm happy for you to, given you wrote most of it.
Well, I mean, it was so basically the way we did this was we chatted, and then I made some rough notes from what was the conversation that we chatted. Then I wrote them into a paragraph. So the way I thought we would write this is the bold things are the main point, and then we just expand those for a paragraph, and then those paragraphs kind of follow from one another, the same way that the points follow from another. And then if people feel that aspects within these paragraphs need expansion, after like Glenn and Ben and I have drafted it, then the idea was just to either make comments or tell us or directly write parts in it that you think are appropriate. And I kind of was thinking that this is how I envisaged we would develop each of these sections and then put them together and see how it floats. And within here, there is, for example, a link to chapter 7 or link to, I think, so the first part can link to the data paper and be more expanded there, for example. But so the question is, do you I guess maybe this kind of doesn't need time to look at it now, but it requires offline time for you all to go through it and just point out whether you agree, whether you think points should be added or taken out from each of these paragraphs, and whether other things should be added as either bulletin points and then expanded.
Sorry, Jasmina, I'm behind the way behind on this.
Well, I mean, it's quite a lot of text, so I'm wary.
Could I just check the structure that you're suggesting? Are you suggesting, I mean, because you've got these 3 bullets at the beginning with bold titles, and then you've got key gaps and challenges and 1, 2, 3 more bullets there. Are the second lot of 3, are these expanding issues? I think what I'm trying to say is that are the first 3 somehow sort of introductions which are detailed further below? What's the connection between the second set of 3 and the first set of 3?
So the way I see the second set of 3 is like zooming on specific points within the first set of 3.
Yes, okay, that's fine. That's sort of what I assumed, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, it's a fair point. If we're writing this within the paper, we might want to reorganize it so that they fit under each other.
Yeah, so you might put them in the
in the 3 bold section.
Yeah,
I think because I think I mean, I know we're talking of 5 sections at the moment, but I think maybe in the final structure, it might be that the actual, as it were, numbered challenges are these sub points, that these 3 might be identified as challenges, in which case I think what you want is something like the 3 top paragraphs, but each leading into material which is the more sharply defined challenge taken from the 3 sections lower down.
And I mean, so and my suggestion is that we do this in 6.4 and 6.5 for next week, but bearing this in mind.
Yeah, sounds good.
That sounds great. And I think, well, a challenge for me is to read what you've already written before next week, because I'm afraid I hadn't read 6.2 and 6.3 before today's meeting. And I think we probably all need a bit of time to sort of think about what's there in all these sections and think how best to move on.
I'm also wondering whether, but maybe it's too early, to whether in order to, I mean, I like the idea of having these separate things, but maybe now putting them into one document and reading that at once, you know, will kind of allow us to, because we're talking about moving here and there. Is it too early to do that?
No, sorry, I wasn't. I think Jasmine, I wasn't suggesting we should change the structure for the moment. I think for the moment you should keep the structure as it is. So maybe integrating the 3 later sections, 3 later paragraphs into the 3 earlier ones.
Okay.
But staying within a single thing called 6.3 with. I'm not suggesting complicating it by introducing more numbering, but I suppose what I'm suggesting is that as we get all these sections 6.1 to 6.5 more sharply focused, each of them may turn out to be several separate paragraphs. So we may look at the whole thing and say, look, actually we have these 5 sections but actually really we've got 12 or whatever it is challenges, which but hopefully doing it the way we're doing it, we'll get a reasonably consistent order that we will, if we end up with 3 things which are expressed as separate challenges, they will be following some sort of logical order. So people will think that each one, we're not just jumping around the topic, so but have some sort of, that we're working through things in a reasonably logical order.
Okay.
So of course, we're probably exploring a higher dimension, so fitting things into one dimension never works entirely.
And I think we need to think about having at least one picture, a figure of some description, because otherwise any paper would need at least some.
Yes. Well, I think if the kind of table, I mean, one possibility for such a figure is maybe the table of that Glenn produced, but you know, reworked, reorganized, or something similar to that. Which, if there's something which is a single table somehow, sort of expresses the relation between all these various challenges, sort of clarifies how they relate to each other, that would be very helpful.
So I mean, yeah, so for 6.2, I don't know whether we've got 5 minutes to go. So I don't know whether, I think it would be better use of time if everyone just reads it offline and comments on it.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
And then maybe we should all have a really strict homework for next week and have somebody has a red pen to mark people down who haven't done it. We do all these sections. Sorry, I have to do marking after we finish this. I'm sharpening my pen. So to sort of think, because I don't know about your time commitments, but it sort of would be good to have a more or less finished draft by the time we speak next to it, or sections of these finished by next week. No?
Yeah. This would be good.
At least to the stage where we can take stuff out or know where we need to add, I think.
Yeah, and as you say, I think at some point, fairly, you know, at that point we can put it all together and try and read it as one document to see how it fits.
That's right.
What's
Because
the,
I guess, sorry.
what's the kind of timeline for this?
Yeah, I was just going
The
to.
papers, yeah. Is there are we aiming for a certain month or date, or is it just kind of free flowing?
Well, I think the original hope was that to get full drafts of all the challenges papers by Christmas, and I think that's I'm pretty sure there are some that are not going to happen in that as quickly as that, but I think we're probably one of the better ones here. So I think we could try and set everyone a good example by trying to do that for this section.
On the other hand, it's quite clear, I think, that some of the other challenges papers will not meet anything like that target. So perhaps we don't need to beat ourselves up too much.
But also there may be a certain amount of bartering. Also, you know, we'll sell you a challenge and in exchange for those two, or whatever.
Yeah.
So it would be nice. It would be nice to try and keep the other ones up to speed. We don't want to slow the quickest down to shoot the laggards. But
it would be really good to have it so that we've got all the main points that we want to make in there, and that, you know, the final sort of polishing is easier to do, but getting the structure, getting all the points so that we feel comfortable that we've captured them all, that would be really good to get done.
Yeah, also we want to capitalize on the momentum that I think we've got a bit of. So
yeah. Hence for next week. Yeah, or the week after. Are we going to have these meetings? They will continue for the next 2-3 weeks. Is that right?
As long as everybody wants them to, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we're trying to set everything up as sort of regular slots so that everybody knows where they are, really, in terms.
Is there a regular slot for the data modeling? Because maybe we were talking with Ben, Glenn and I that maybe the stuff that we are thinking about here but not putting here, we could put there. Is there a regular slot for that?
No, but I think it's a good suggestion that we should go to the other people who are involved in a potential data paper and see if they could meet with at least the three of you as well, have a conversation about, you know, whether there's a need for a separate data paper and what kind of structure it might have. Yeah,
I think Nigel led on that originally, so maybe that was something that if he's interested in being involved, we could speak to him about.
Yeah, and there's the other Nigel too who is interested. I think Nigel Shadbolt.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably Valerie and me to try and go back to people who are supposed to be interested in data and try and corner them.
Did you, Kira, have you made any progress on that at all, or is this?
No, that's on my
Okay.
to-do list. I've been focusing on economics, so I've got a group together for that. But
Sure,
yeah.
no, that's fine. I just wanted to check that there wasn't something already in hand. That's fine.
Can I, because you mentioned economics, Kira, is Mark Scalfer at York involved at all with that economics group?
No, I'm just trying to sort of pull together people I know. So if you know anyone who you think would be good to ask,
the only reason why I'm suggesting, because he contacted me because he is running a systematic review or a scoping review of economic plus EPI models to report to somebody. I'm not sure if it's BIM or somebody like that. So he might want to be involved in that. I can link you both if you want.
Yeah, that would be
really good.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, so I've got a few people who I know previously who do economic and epi modeling, which they've tended to do more for like plant and animal health. But so some of them are going to come along. But yeah, any additional people for economics or any other groups that people think any other of the papers, always still welcome.
And I was just to ask for the intervention one, is it okay to include Catriona, because she would like to be involved, I think. Maybe she can help with the intervention and the policy part. I just contact her and ask her directly to meet when we meet as a small subgroup.
Yeah.
Valerie, Dennis, that's
Yes, of course. If she has time.
Well, she wanted to, so she emailed me, so I presume she might have some.
Yeah, okay.
I know she's very busy.
This is Catriona
Shia.
Yes, yeah, we're talking about the same person. Just wanted to make.
Yeah. So, Lisa,
I'm just going to say I just need to go. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much done anyway. So thank you very much,